Hi everyone, Pastor Matt here again with another weekly encouragement video. I wanted to talk a little bit more this week about the message we had at church this last Sunday as we looked at the story of Jacob wrestling with a man or possibly God on the banks of the Jabbok River. We talk a lot about wrestling with God, and I certainly guess there are a lot of examples in Scripture of people wrestling with God in different ways. We've obviously got the example of Jacob, but you also hear in the discourse between Job and God some of the frustration and the struggle that Job has with the way that his life has turned out. We also hear elements of that in some of the disciple Peter's understanding of God and his grace as he comes to terms with God's love and grace through Jesus Christ, not just being for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. He really seems to struggle with that and to question God on that. But in all of these things, I've kind of come to realize as I've reflected on it over the last week or so that, we struggle mostly with ourselves. In all of those situations we've just seen from the Bible, I think it's fair to say that people were frustrated and wrestling with their situation because things hadn't turned out the way that they had expected. Things hadn't gone the way that they thought that they would. And I think that's where we tend to find ourselves wrestling with God too, isn't it? When, life doesn't turn out the way that we expected. And I'm pretty sure that none of us expected the COVID-19 pandemic to affect us the way that it has. And so many of us are probably still sitting at home wrestling with God about this. Perhaps you're wondering when you're going to be able to return to work, or what impact this virus is going to have on your ability to visit parents and relatives who might be suffering from different illnesses and just need a visit or some care. We might be struggling with the idea that even though restrictions have been eased somewhat, we're still not quite in a position where we're ready and able to worship together in our churches just yet. All of these things are things that we're wrestling with at the moment. But like I said, our wrestling in those situations, I'm not so sure whether it's actually with God or whether it's with um, our own condition. The fact that we feel like we need to be in control or should be able to determine what happens to us. It reminds me of a bit of the passage from Romans chapter 7, where the Apostle Paul talks about not doing what he wants to do, but instead finding himself always doing the very things which he hopes to avoid. He says, I do not do what I want, but the things that I hate, that is what I find myself doing. And I think there's an element of that in this situation for us. I think we all know that we're called to trust God in all things. Yet when we question him in a situation like this, it shows us that perhaps we have a lack of trust when things get hard. Perhaps we're still holding on to a sense of control where we get to determine our own fate in all situations, but at the moment that control seems to have been wrested from us. So my encouragement for us this week is to think about what it is we're actually struggling with, and actually to put that at the feet of the cross, because that's where God dealt with all of these things with which we struggle. Our own sinfulness, our own selfishness, all of those things God has actually dealt with. And we're no longer under the law and that sense of obligation to do this, that, or the other, but God has done all of that for us. So even our sin is no longer a barrier between us and our relationship with God. In the craziness of life, when everything else seems out of control, the one thing that we can rely on is the fact that God has claimed us as his own through the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. And there's no need to wrestle with him. He's got our best interests at heart, and he loves and cares for us even in the midst of all of this. And he's big enough to handle our wrestling. If we do have questions, we can give them to him and know that he will take those things on and look after us even in the midst of these difficult times. So trust him. Trust him with everything. That's it from me this week. I hope you all have a blessed week, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.